not feeling well, I can't hear. And Jack had, I can't remember, Jack had, I just met Jack's mother today.
Interesting.
I just sent him an email that I would record the lecture, and also I told him, here's what I said. I shouldn't be recording this. So I'm not going to record it. If you have your notes from last Wednesday,
13.
so on Monday, we'll start with the presidency stuff. We still have 3 weeks of class, right?
Unfortunately.
Listen to you.
Wow. Listen, okay, it's been a day. It's been a day. That's all you need.
Tell me about your day, Aaron.
I woke up.
By the way, the Banfield article that I discussed in the last notes, I sent it out, and it's on Canvas. It's not. It used to be in the Nickel Reader, but in an earlier edition. But I found the argument so compelling that I put it in front of my students. And by the way, I sent out not only the
Almost. Yeah. No, this is about to be the best class ever.
Sorry.
Anytime you're here, it's the best class ever.
Automatically.
Oh, it just got better. Why don't you guys move this way or down way, because otherwise it's just Gracie on that side, because Jack and Josh are out today. You're right, it is the best class ever. Oh, sorry. So, what's your major, Aaron?
English.
Are you a freshman, right?
Nope.
What year are you?
This is my second year.
So, I didn't even realize that the former head of the English department had retired. It used to be Aaron Rose. No,
Anita
Rose, sorry. Had you had her for class?
Yeah.
She just retired in December. I didn't even know that. Bless her heart, as they say. All right. So I'll send out a revised schedule, and so essentially we'll start the presidency next Monday. So what you were supposed to read for Monday, and then for today, but because Reed got us off track on. I did send out the references to the books that we discussed, and again, if you're interested in the question of climate change, I really recommend those. But I also sent out actually copies, if you look at the email, of the 2 favorable articles and the 2 unfavorable articles of the books that I'm using, because I really think students should have both points of view. But if this is an issue important to you, it's worth actually reading up on this. None of you, my guess is, are physicists or chemists.
Almost.
I could tell. Are any of you a biology major?
I am. I'm switching to business though.
You?
I've been in the cast for like 3 weeks now.
Well, sometimes you have majors. Huh?
Yeah.
Well, it's because it was just Gracie on this side, and there's Noel and Kiki to move over to that side, so it would look more balanced.
It's okay.
All right, so you should have the notes from last Wednesday. And again, we'll start the presidency on Monday, and I'll send out a revised schedule. So here's where we are. We actually, it wasn't a total waste of discussion on Monday because it reinforced the link between the Electoral College and the party system. So if you're looking at the notes, let me walk you through. Here are the major parts of the notes. In some ways, if I say we're talking about the American party system or the 2-party system, you have a right as an undergraduate, as a college student, to know, well, why the hell should I care about this? Why is it important? And let me throw out a thesis that it's not in the notes, but it might help you frame the issue and why it's worth spending attention on, and why it might be important to the nation and to its future, and for that matter, the quality of the lives that we lead. There's going to be one of the interesting articles for the presidency you'll read, not for next Wednesday, for the week after, when we turn to criticisms of the presidency. In the Nichols Reader, there is an article called The Rise of the Rhetorical Presidency, and it's multi-authored by Jeff Toulis and a couple of other people. And one of the articles, and one of my professors at the University of Virginia who just retired this year, and actually wrote one of the other articles that I'm going to refer to in the party system, and that's Jim Caesar. the thesis of this article, The Rise of the Rhetorical Presidency, makes the argument that the modern president is resorting more and more to images and speech to try to govern the nation as opposed to solid policy. And one problem with that is that you may undermine the capacity of the government to govern. If you turn the government into incessant cheerleading, when in reality there are problems that are being unsolved or unaddressed, what might it do to the population and indeed to the very capacity of the government to govern if the government keeps on cheerleading and overpromising but can't deliver what it promises? What will that eventually... Imagine if your parents kept on promising you something and kept on putting it off or never did it. What would that do to your trust in your parents? Why? What would happen? What's the problem?
If they promise to deliver and then they don't, then what worth does their promise have?
And they're either dishonest or incompetent. So on one level you could say, well, isn't that the very definition of government? No. I mean, good government addresses real problems and makes them better. Bad government either makes things worse or doesn't address real issues. Now, I don't care if you're a Republican or a Democrat, and there are plenty of failures on both sides of the political spectrum, and no president is utterly, simply successful. Although, say, take somebody like Abraham Lincoln. Was Abraham Lincoln a successful president? We'll turn to this question, by the way, when we turn to the presidency. Was he successful?
For the most part.
How would you measure that?
Well, he took issues that he saw, he passed on the solution for him to solve the problems.
What did he see as the main task as he assumed the presidency?
Slavery, right? No?
He was anti-slavery, but he wasn't an abolitionist in the sense that, first of all, let's be clear about this, he didn't think he had the power to remove slavery constitutionally in the South where it existed. Because, as we saw from the Constitution, doesn't the Constitution protect slavery three places?
Yeah.
So he wanted to preserve, here, I'll just answer the question, but you're on the right track. He wanted to save the Union. Did he save the Union? Have you ever been to Washington and visited the Lincoln Memorial? Never? You've been to Washington?
Yeah.
You know what it says above the Lincoln Memorial statue?
It's been a while since I've been to Washington.
Well, you probably didn't memorize it like I did. In this temple is in the hearts of the American people for whom he saved the Union. The memory of Abraham Lincoln is enshrined forever. He did save the Union. He set out to save the Union, and he saved it. He was assassinated, and 750,000 young men died, and 2 million were wounded. The South's economy and society was destroyed. And by the way, on the question of liberating slaves, he didn't think he could do it by presidential action. What actually started the process of liberating the slaves? He did, by the way, he did start the engine, but he didn't. Why couldn't he simply, as an act as president, declare for presidential action that slavery was over in the South? Why couldn't he do that?
Has to go through the people. Has to go through a lot of people, actually.
Well, strictly speaking, yeah, people I'd agree with, actually.
Yeah.
But where was slavery protected?
I'm sorry.
Where? I mean, that was a bad question. Isn't it protected in the Constitution? Yeah, agreed.
Oh, I was gonna say, because the Confederacy was like a different, like, they weren't part of the Union, he couldn't control it.
Even if this Confederacy had never seceded, although his election was the event that tore the country apart and and persuaded them to secede. His election was the proximate cause of the secession. But even if they hadn't seceded and remained in the Union, could he, as president, have constitutionally ended slavery?
I don't think so.
What did it take to end slavery? It took the military destruction of the South, let's be clear about that. And not just the destruction of the South. You understand that in the Reconstruction period, the federal government essentially took over the administration of Southern society. It took the 13th Amendment. What did the 13th Amendment do?
Well,
So, you understand, first he wanted to save the Union, then he wanted to preserve the Constitution. If he had tried to end slavery presidentially, before the 13th Amendment, what would you have had to step outside of and break? The Constitution. Do you understand that? I mean, it was a truly tragic position. But let's be clear. The secession of the South. Now, by the way, what were his options when the South seceded? Who was president before him? By the way, that person has the honor of being one of the, by historians and political scientists and most observers, of being the second worst president of the United States. Do you know who's generally viewed as the worst president of the United States? Huh? Warren Harding. There was, for all sorts of reasons. Anybody know who was president before Lincoln? Who was the 15th president of the United States? Lincoln was the 16th president. James Buchanan. Aside from being ugly as sin, he has another interesting historical distinguishing feature. He's been the only bachelor president. All of the presidents have been married or got married in the White House. When I teach the presidency, I love to teach the rise of the campaign system, which is somewhat involved in what we're talking about today. Grover Cleveland was a bachelor when he was elected president, but got married. But anybody know what the problem with Grover Cleveland was? That it was part of the campaign issue? He had an illegitimate son. You know what the campaign slogan for James Blaine, who was his opponent, campaign was?
It talked about like his baby, or like.
Here was the slogan: "Ma, Ma, where's my pa? Gone to the White House, ha ha ha." Isn't that a great campaign slogan? For that matter, you know what the Cleveland and campaign slogan against Blaine was? Blaine, Blaine, James T. Blaine, continental liar from the state of Maine. Great campaign slogans. Anyway, when did the South begin to secede? I may have mentioned this, you might know this historically. What was the first state to secede?
South.
When did they do it? Lincoln was elected in November of 1860. When did South Carolina secede from the Union? December 21st. When did Lincoln take the oath of office? You might not remember this discussion, but we talked about it when we talked about the Constitution of the Amendments. The 20th Amendment moved the date of taking office for President and Congress from March to January. Do you remember why the date of inauguration was in March for both President and Congress? In our discussion of the founding of the Constitution? It so happens, just a couple of dates, remember, the Constitution was ratified during June and July of 1788. The last act of Congress under the Articles of Confederation was to call for elections under the new Constitution, which took place in November of 1788. Do you remember why our elections have always been in November? What were most Americans job-wise?
Farmers.
What's over by November?
Harvest season.
And that left farmers free to come into town to vote. So that's why our elections have always been in November. When did the new Congress actually meet, and when did George Washington take the oath of office? They didn't meet until March 4th, 1789, after the elections and everything, and they counted the Electoral College votes, and Washington was actually declared president in April of 1789. So we just kept March as the inauguration day. So when did Lincoln actually become president? March 1st, they moved it March 1st, 1861. So South Carolina had already seceded in December of 1860, before, why? Because Lincoln was elected. And by February, all the other 10 states of the Confederacy, eventually joined by Texas, had already seceded. So, could Lincoln have ended slavery constitutionally if the had not seceded, if the South had not seceded? What would he have had to have broken in order to liberate the slaves? But you all read the presidential oath of office. The president takes an oath to preserve, protect, and to the best of his here's what the presidential oath says: I do solemnly swear to execute the office of the presidency, and to solemnly preserve, protect, and defend the Constitution of the United States. Can you destroy the Constitution at the same time that you save it? So that was, he was in a tragic situation. It was the secession of the South that gave him the military reason. Now, sorry, I asked about James Buchanan and why that's important. It became clear already by the end of Buchanan's term that the South was going to secede, right? What did he do as president to stop it? He gave a speech in early January that said, please don't. Don't do that. Stop that. That's a great speech, isn't it? Did it work?
No.
And how did Lincoln respond? No, no, no. No, no, no. How's that for a presidential speech? What did he do when the South Carolinian troops fired on Fort Sumter in April of 1861? What did he do? He started the war. Well, excuse me, who started the war? I just told you.
The South.
By firing on, what was Fort Sumter? Haven't you been to Charleston, Fort Sumter?
The military base.
Yeah, it was a federal northern military base. So on one level, let's not get into that question, but my point there is this. Lincoln chose to go to war to keep the South in the Union. That was the opening to the liberation of slaves. Because what was the first official act that actually declared slavery over? By Lincoln. The what?
Was it not the 13th Amendment?
I didn't hear what you said.
Was it not the 13th Amendment?
No, Lincoln, the president can't pass constitutional amendments. That's, and look in Article 5. The Emancipation Proclamation in 1863. Which slaves did the Emancipation Proclamation free?
Wasn't it like...
The ones that fought in the war.
That's close to it, but you'll see your answer is close to it. It only freed the slaves in those rebelling states. Because what constitutional authority did Lincoln have to lead the war and under what constitutional authority did he actually free the slaves? Commander-in-Chief. It was a war measure. Then, after the South was defeated, then he got the 13th Amendment passed. He couldn't pass the 13th Amendment, but he did, and then of course a couple of days after it was passed, he was assassinated. So you could say Lincoln wanted to end slavery, and the Civil War gave him an odd opportunity to do it at a tragic cost. My point here is this, is that in some ways, this was a departure from the question of the article that you're going to read for the presidency. Lincoln promised something, and he delivered it. At a terrible cost, to be sure, right? If you keep promising things you don't deliver, what's going to happen? Aaron, I mean, you said it. Can government govern ultimately if the people lose confidence in it?
No.
So on one level, you could say this. The question of the party system, as you're going to argue, as you're going to see, what I'm going to argue that what the party system does, and what the two-party system does is, it actually is a bridge between government and the people that, in some ways, it does all kinds of things, and we're going to start out with a discussion of what its core functions does. What does the party system contribute to the political system? And why do all, in fact, remember, all modern democracies, all modern constitutional governments, regardless of whether they're parliamentary or separation of powers like ours, all modern democracy has party systems. There seems to be something about party systems that modern government needs, and I'll try to explore that right off. But the two-party system, I'm going to argue, I'll tell you where this lecture is going. It adds something critical that the constitutional system may not possess as well if it were to evaporate or transform into something else. And that is the capacity to increase the capacity of the government to govern. And so, in some ways, Banfield's defense of the two-party system that you'll see at the end of this lecture is that, again, if I can beat you around the ears a bit, when we turn to the section of party system, remember I said political choice isn't just between an absolute good and an absolute bad, and it isn't just between some imaginary future. All human choice operates within a universe of what practical alternatives are. Again, I think I remember asking you, Ms. Shayla, when you go to buy a car, do all of you set out buying the car of your dreams?
Oh.
Why not?
Not affordable.
First of all, it's impossible for most of us. So what does start to shape your actual choice about what car to buy?
Quality, price.
And what you need, right?
Yeah.
So nobody makes a choice in an abstract universe of infinite possibility. So when it comes to the party system, again, let me remind you, and you can look at your notes, what are the 4 only available possible alternatives to the 2-party system or to any party system? What are the possibilities when it comes to a party system?
One-party system.
1 party,
Two-party.
2 parties,
Multi-party.
multi-parties, and
Non-party.
non-parties. In which case, if parties don't organize people's behavior in elections and nominations, then what would be the other 2 things available to organize people's voting behavior? You remember? We talked about this, yeah. Issues or candidates themselves. How many, again, I think President Biden won the election. I'm a Republican and I voted for Trump, but I think Biden won the election. I didn't buy President Trump's argument that the election was stolen. Having said that, how many of you think more people, and since, by the way, there are only about 30% Republicans, 30% Democrats, and 30% Independents, how many of you think, I certainly think this, how many of you think as many people voted for Biden as voted, no, how many people think they voted against Trump as for Biden? You see what I'm asking? In other words, I think for many people voting in the 2020 presidential election,
They didn't want Biden to win, they didn't want Trump to win.
yeah, exactly. And it wasn't so much whether they were Republican or Democrat. Some people hated Trump so much and thought he was such a bad president, they would have voted for Reid if it was.
I don't know, I think it's a little bit of a stretch.
I do too. But they might have voted for Kiki.
Oh, yeah, definitely.
Anyway, so if there aren't any parties to organize vote, and we're going to see how do parties organize choice, and you're going to see. It might seem like a trivial difference between 1, 2, or many parties, but as you're going to see from the Buchanan article, a 1-party system, and this, we already talked about this. In those nations that have enforced 1-party systems like North Korea and and the People's Republic, what does voting mean there? Xi Jinping was elected with 99% of the vote. As you're going to see, Banfield will make this point. One problem with the 1-party system is, what do the voters not have any?
Option.
Yeah, there's no choice.
Yeah.
Don't elections only make sense if there's a choice? I mean, if you had to go shopping and there was only one kind of toilet paper in the toilet, but America would be devastated.
That's hot stuff.
And firm. How many have ever been in another country? I don't mean South Carolina. I mean, what country?
Ireland.
What kind of toilet paper do they have there?
I don't remember, I was like 10.
I've been to
Wasn't on my mind.
2 other countries besides Israel and India and Egypt in the 1990s. You know what their toilet paper was like?
Sam?
Like sandpaper. I'm not kidding. And this lecture is not about toilet paper. It's about choice. But they had no. But on one level, one of the arguments for the free market is if you have competition, then that forces people to compete for. But competition only works if there's real competition and if the consumer has choice. So on one level, can't you see the automatic problem with a 1-party system? And it turns out 1-party systems tend to have the most endemic corruption. Why?
There's too much power.
Yeah, and there's no way to hold them accountable.
Yeah.
So on one level, how many of you get the idea that for free elections to be effective, there has to be choice, real competition? Does that make sense? Now, So therefore, if we're really talking about possible and desirable outcomes, nobody would seem to me, except if you're a communist in the People's Republic, or in Cuba, or in North Korea, nobody wants a one-party system. Does that make sense? Do you understand why? So what are the real alternatives we're talking about here?
Like the multi-party system and the non-partisan.
Yeah, as alternatives to the two-party system. Does that make sense? And that's the way I want to frame the question. So if you're looking at the notes, what do parties do? What are their functions as institutions in the institutional system? Now remember, this is one area where the framers, who were pretty insightful and foresaw a lot in politics, they didn't see this. Most of the framers are actually opposed to organized political parties because they thought it would divide the nation. They thought that it would lead to fractionalization. And by the way, have parties divided the nation? I mean, our two-party system's in an interesting moment right now with intense energies of polarization. When was probably the most polarized time in our history? We just talked about it.
The 2020 election.
No, I was going to say the Civil War.
That one was pretty recent too.
Well, I was talking about our history. I mean, I didn't mean since the time you were born. The 2020 election was pretty polarizing. How many of you thought there was talk of civil war? And actually some people were advocating secession. Some people wanted Texas to secede. There's still a movement within California to secede from the Union. It may be called the San Andreas Fault. But wasn't the Civil War clearly the most polarized time in our history? Where a presidential election and party division split the Union. I'd say the second most polarized time was probably the 1790s, when the party system grew, because the polarization was so intense by the end of the decade that people viewed like Jefferson versus Adams, almost like Trump versus Biden. Then I have to say, actually, I think our present period may be the third most polarized time. Now you might say, well, isn't this a good argument against two parties then? As you're going to see, it's not an argument against two parties, because that question of why we're so polarized now, the solution would not be, by the way, to abolish the two-party system. Because you're going to see the fractionalization of a multi-party system, I think, would actually damage the country even more. And when it comes to voting by candidate and voting by issue, I guess one point I hoped in the last two classes we had where I got off track because of Reed's bad influence, I was trying to make you think like single issue voters. And what's the problem with single issue voting? Politics is more, one problem with single issue voting is politics is complicated, life is complicated. As parents, how many of your parents were single issue people that could and would only deal with one issue in your life? Actually, that's a crazy statement, isn't it?
Yeah.
I mean, what if your kid's doing badly in school? What if your kid develops cancer? What if you lose your job and you go and you become? Isn't life itself full of competing and complicated issues? If you can't reduce parenthood to one issue, do you think you can reduce politics to one issue? Moreover, without insulting anybody in this room, would it be fair to say that one of the results of the discussion in the last two class sessions is, one, you guys know almost nothing about the issues that you even care about? Is that a fair statement? Again, I'm not attacking you, although I am trying to point the way forward, how you should live your lives, and what you should take seriously as students. And for that matter, when it comes to candidates, if I can ask, I mean, how many of you can imagine voting against Biden or against Trump? There were plenty of reasons to vote against either of those people, right? But what's different between the presidential election and almost every other election in our country? Can I ask you, how many of you think you have real choice if you don't know a damn thing about what you're choosing?
What's the question?
How many of you think you have real choice if you don't know a damn thing about what you're choosing? Yeah, Aaron?
That reminds me of informed consent in medical practice.
Very good. Because if you have no idea about what the doctors are giving you a choice about, what might you as well do?
Make a choice that you wouldn't if you knew, like, the consequences.
But if you don't know anything about the procedure or the nature of the thing, your choice is meaningless, isn't it? You might as well, I acted out what you might as well do, flip a coin. Doesn't choice imply information? And what's the problem when it comes to, here, let me complete my question. How many of you were alive during the election of 2020? How many of you paid attention to it? How many had opinions about it? My guess is you were probably driven by opinions about either Trump or Biden. Is that a fair statement? First of all, because of the people in this class, when I asked if any of you had strong party identification or came from a family that was, I think Jack was the only person in the room who said that his parents were politically active. Again, how many of your parents and families had a political identity or had a political component? When you think about who your parents are their political opinions part of who you think they are? Is it part of who they are?
They purposely don't tell me that. Like, not even joking. I'll ask them about it and be like, no, I'm not talking about that with you.
Is it because they want you to make up your own mind? Is that the
I
idea?
guess. Either that or they know that I'll tell them that I think their opinions are crap.
Do you know who Thomas More was?
This sounds familiar.
He was the Archbishop of Canterbury who was executed. It wasn't the Archbishop of Canterbury, but he was executed by Henry VIII for disagreeing with him. And as he was being about to have his head chopped off, he asked to address the crowd, and they said, no, we won't listen. So he said, well, if no one's going to listen, I won't speak. So on one level, I see what you're saying. But how many of you voted in the 2020 election? Did you vote against one of the candidates or for one of the candidates, or because you have a party point of view?
Both.
Okay. And most people do. My point that I'm trying to make here is, beyond the presidential election, not only does turnout tend to go into the low 30s for most congressional elections, in Charlotte, in the municipal elections for mayor and city council, you know what percentage of Charlotteans participate? About 10%. Now, on one level, one problem is, beyond the presidential level and a couple of Senate races and everything like that, my guess is you know who Tim Scott is. You know who Lindsey Graham is. So, here's my point. You know something about those guys. How many of you even know who your how many of you are from Greenville, Spartanburg? Jack is, because he lives here. Who's your congressman or congressperson? Who's your representative in Congress, Aaron? Katie?
No.
Gracie? Kiki? Noel? You don't even know who your congressman is.
Jack would have known.
Huh?
Jack would have known.
He would have known. He does know. Because, by the way, he comes from a politically active family.
Yeah.
Think about this. So when you step into the voting booth, and what's Americans' major source of political information aside from political party affiliation?
Social media.
TikTok.
Well, actually, that question, the answer to that question has kind of changed in the last 5 years and 10 years because of social media. It's television advertising, political commercials, and how many of you love those, take notes during them, and are persuaded by them?
I mute the TV.
Well, my guess is most of you view, as do I, most political advertising is bullshit.
I was about to say, because, like, isn't there, like, certain news companies are more democratic, some are more political? I mean, not
No, it's right.
Republicans, like,
Newspapers and television and media outlets have become more partisan too.
yeah.
But they've always been to some degree.
I don't remember what class we learned it in. It was, like, Fox or CNN is, like, more whatever than blah, blah. So they always
The mainstream television stations tend to be more, because actually 90% of their reporters and employees are all liberal Democrats. Now, that doesn't mean you can't learn the news from them. And I want to make sure you understand my fundamental point. Do you trust political advertising as a source of genuine information about the candidates you're voting for? What about social
One
media?
would. They're telling you what you want to hear.
There you go. It's like any other kind of commercial.
They just want
Huh? So, as you're going to see, what's my point? My point is, if you're not going to have party affiliation guiding people's choices, what are the other two alternatives? Issues and candidates. What's the problem with issues? We already discussed that. What's the problem with candidates?
You're just trying to like vote against the other ones sometimes.
And what do you know about the candidates you're voting for?
Nothing.
So on one level, as you're going to see, the argument for a party system is that it actually adds some intelligent dimension of information, what political scientists call cues. In other words, even if you didn't know anything about Biden and Trump in the election of 2020, knowing that one was a Republican and one was a Democrat, that wouldn't tell you everything about them, right? But would it have told you some useful information?
Yeah.
What's the alternative for all of you that PhDs in political science? Let me tell you, when I moved to North Carolina, I actually became a North Carolina citizen for 1 year, and then I realized they had car inspection. I probably shouldn't be saying this when that's being recorded.
If you slide them a 20 right Carolina, I got to find tags too. They'll patch you for anything.
Well, and the problem is state inspection is often corrupt and awful. And South Carolina got rid of it about 20 years ago.
See, I have North Carolina tags, and when I go to Charlotte, I know, man, and I get
There you go.
tags.
Well, bless your heart. So you wanted to get around it.
It's my tent, but I bought the car like that, so you know.
Okay, so it was important for me to resume my South Carolinian citizenship just so I could register my car here.
You save $20, you know?
Well, not only that, registration's a pain in the ass. I mean, inspection, not inspection.
I know what you
Why am I saying this? Because in North Carolina, some states do this. We'll talk about this when we turn to the judiciary at the end of the course. How do our judges on the federal level in the Constitution get to be the Supreme Court judges and federal judges?
They get like appointed.
By whom?
President.
And ratified by the? Correct. Remember the Senate? The Senate ratifies treaties and appointments.
She deserves extra credit.
Katie gets a gold star.
Oh yeah. If you don't bring in gold star stickers at some point, I'm gonna be disappointed.
Look, Aaron gets no
Oh
gold
my
star.
God.
I've got something better than gold stars.
How?
I'm
She's
that's
the
what
other
I'm
odd
okay.
and everyone school
The first
is
time
over.
I this too,
Her
the
here
second
is
time we
remembered.
learned.
She stayed on top of me.
I like how she's a good your question and answer Lisbon.
When I asked my question first.
And the problem with egalitarian America today, if you give somebody a trophy, you have to give everyone a trophy.
Yeah. I deserve a gold
So
star.
I'm going to give you a special treat, but it's for everybody. What holiday did you just celebrate, if you're Christian?
It wouldn't be why you at E.
East.
That wasn't a difficult question. No, I'm not Christian, I'm a Jew. What holiday did I celebrate and am celebrating? It's an 8-day holiday. Passover. What do you eat on Passover?
Unleavened bread.
Yay.
Matzah.
Unsalted crackers?
No, unsalted matzah. This is unleavened bread. So take some, enjoy.
Why does lemon bread need salt?
Yeah.
And yes, Katie, this is your special prize for knowing that the Senate ratifies presidential appointments.
Thank you.
But I brought enough for everybody.
Break it in half. Here, you want some?
No, eat the whole damn
We're gonna
thing.
get you
Oh, the
out.
whole thing? No, just a little.
All right. So,
Oh Lord, why so big?
North Carolina residency. So for 1 year, I voted in North Carolina as a North Carolina citizen. The reason I asked about how we get to be judges, most states follow the federal constitution. Judges are appointed by the governor and ratified by the state senate, just like the president appoints. But because of the progressive movement, which is important because you're going to see we're going to talk about the progressive movement at the turn of the 19th and 20th century, the progressive movement in general wanted to restructure American institutions so that there was more popular and democratic influence. As a result, how many of you believe, by the way, we'll come to this question when we talk about the Supreme Court, how many of you think the Supreme Court decisions have a profound effect on the nation?
What do you mean profound?
Well, for instance, you're an African American, right? If you had been born in one of the southern states prior to 1954, how would you have been educated?
Said 1954?
Yeah. What clearly am I pointing to?
Segregation.
Yeah. What did the court decide in what case? You all know this, in 1954. Brown v. Board of Education. Did that have an effect on the nation? In 2003, the Supreme Court overturned all state legislation criminalizing homosexuality. It overturned one of its decisions in 1981, which actually legalized state criminalization. Do you think that changed people's lives? So on one level, do Supreme Court decisions affect the country? Of course, in profound ways. Some people have argued the Supreme Court should be elected because of its effect on the country. I'm actually profoundly opposed to that for the reason I'm about to mention, which we'll get back to voter choice and party identification. In North Carolina is one of about 10 states that adopted reforms of the judicial appointment process at the turn of the century under the influence of the progressive movement. Some states actually elect their judges. What most states do is a hybrid system of the governor appoints for the first term, but then they have to go for re-election to stay in office. Now, you're going to see what the problem is. I'm a political scientist. I have a PhD in political science. I know that just changes all of your views of me. But here's my point. When I went into the voting booth, I knew I was going to vote for president. I knew I was going to vote for senator, etc., that kind of stuff. And even because I'm a committed Republican. One problem is, in most states that have judicial election, they forbid judges and candidates for re-election to declare their party identification. Why? Why would that? They prevent judges from running for re-election based on a party identification. Why? What are judges supposed to be?
Oh, they're not supposed to decide.
Yeah, they're supposed to be impartial. But here's the problem. There were 4 judges up for election. And when I say I'm a political scientist, I'm pretty informed about the American political system and about most of the political issues of the day. I read 4 newspapers. I actually follow several websites. I read 14 political journals on a regular basis. Here's the problem. I didn't know a damn thing about those 4 judges. So on one thing, you could say, well, it's your fault. You should have done the research on them and everything like that. But how many U.S. citizens do you think would do the research on it? I'm busy with my life just like you are yours, right? I know, isn't it terrible?
The more you eat, the better it gets. I'm not gonna lie to you.
Oh, tried for 8 days. Now you know why God invented fiber. My point here is this. If you're utterly ignorant as to your choice, isn't your choice meaningless?
Yes.
So on one level, if you take away the organizing information of party identification, won't you actually be turning most Americans as voters over to ignorance, impression by manipulative ads, and ignorance about issues?
Yeah.
So on one level, this whole speech was in some ways to try to prove to you not only that the idea of parties are important as an element of the political system, because what does it do? It guides and informs people's choice. Because you may not remember this article Sentinel that we read earlier in the semester. He was the opponent of the Constitution that advocated government on the local level. Do you remember why he thought that government should remember on the local level, among other things? He said because the people generally pay very little attention to politics. Do you think that's true? So, and yet, aren't our elections supposed to be driven by popular opinion? So, how do you have intelligent popular opinion in a situation where people don't know a damn thing about the system that they're living under and that they're being controlled by and that they know nothing about? That you can do what the People's Republic do. What's happening in China right now? It's really quite fascinating to see. You understand that in the People's Republic, has erected the most extensive means of supervising and spying on their population. How many of you have ever read the novel 1984? Big Big Brother, it makes that look like kindergarten. In China, once you walk outside of your apartment, it's estimated that you are recognized by the public computer system within 5 seconds. And moreover, they tie everything you can do in society to your opposition to or support for the government. So guess what? There aren't any protest riots in China. Why?
So you'd be killed, right?
Or you'll be imprisoned in everything. Except what has just happened in the last week. What's happening in China? COVID has broken out. The last variant of COVID, which is not deadly, but where did COVID come from?
Supposedly them.
No, it came from China.
It's coming from the government. The government is infected.
Well, I'm open-minded on whether it was a cross-species thing like the wet market leak, or whether it was a lab leak. I'm not a conspiratorialist. I don't think that the Chinese government purposely invented, some people believe this, invented COVID to destroy the West. The problem is, now it's turned against their own people. I think it was probably a lab leak, and they tried to cover it up.
Yeah.
But it could have been, nobody really knows this for sure. But on the other hand, China, which is a totalitarian system, anybody know what the population of Shanghai is? One of the largest cities in the world, 25 million people. They have locked it down for the last 2 weeks totally. They're trying to contain through lockdowns. How many of you enjoyed the lockdowns?
There were not lockdowns. Stop it.
Well, the Chinese government is really doing a lockdown. And people are starving now, and their facilities are terrible. And for the first time since 2007, there have been popular demonstrations in China. Now, my point about this is how many would prefer to live your life like a citizen of the People's Republic? Doing your job, raising your family, watching video games, but having no effect on the political system around you. And why can't you have an effect on the political system around you in China?
Because you go to jail.
Yeah, especially if you disagree with the government. So on one level, one thing you have to say about the United States, it gives you the possibility to affect your environment. But what happens if Sentinel is right, that the people don't pay attention to the very elections that determine the scope of their government? Well, as you're going to see, that's tied up with the issue of party. So, as you're going to see, the argument for two parties is two parties do a better job of allowing the government to govern, allowing the people to have some kind of choice and input. I mean, on one level, if you're shopping for a car, how many of you want to choose between 73 cars? What's the problem of choosing between 73 cars?
Nonsense.
So, and when you finally bought your car, it came down to probably 2 or 3, right? So on one level, isn't giving somebody 73 cars to choose from actually destroys their choice? Giving them 2 or 3 cars gives them intelligible, manageable choice, don't you think? And how many of you think the country would have been different if Trump had been elected rather than Biden? For better or worse? So, on one level, your single vote won't change the entire direction of the nation, is that clear? But does the people voting affect the direction of the nation? Does it determine everything? No, but does it determine something? And does it determine something important? How many of you think the country would have been different? It would have been the same country, but not exactly the same country had Biden lost and Trump won. Did that make sense? So on one level, the argument for the two-party, or at least a three-party system, and you'll see a multi-party system, then the problem with the multi-party system is it does in fact divide the population up. Israel has 33 political parties. And by the way, their organized coalition is about to fall. What's the problem with having 33 political parties? Actually, this is part of the Banfield article that we'll end with.
Well, when one party can't get like a majority of the votes because there's so many.
And it ends up dividing and fractionalizing the public. And as you're going to see, let me help you with Biden's article, or Biden. Banfield, senior moment. Banfield argues in a multi-party system, you start to approximate a single issue system. Because each small party tends to represent single issues, right? Now, it's true, it still guides people's vote. If you vote for Labor or Likud in Israel, let's get some choice. But if you're voting from a choice of 33 parties, it's very hard to establish a direction for the government. And that tends to be one of the major problems with parliamentary multi-party systems. It's very hard for government because in order to govern, they have to get a coalition a majority coalition, and that means like the governing coalition in Israel is a coalition of 16 parties. But now 2 members of the parties, the Arab parties and the religious parties, have decided to drop out of the coalition. What happened to the governing majority? It's evaporated. Israel went through 5 elections in the last 2 years. And you might think, oh boy, the more elections, the more. By the way, what country in the world has more elections than any other country in the world? We do. Do you know how many elected positions there are in the United States? About 57,000 elected positions. Do you think that people would start paying more attention to politics if you asked them to fill each one of those 57,000 positions? Now, most of them are on the state, local level, you understand that. But one problem is, take a country like Australia. Australia tends to have 97% political turnout, but you know why? They only have like 5 parties, and also you get fined if you don't vote. How many of you would think we should fine people for not voting? Punish people for not voting?
I feel like it would just cause people to just like not care about who they vote for. Like they just be like, oh, I just have to vote.
People that don't care would have an influence.
Yeah.
But they'd have to vote, wouldn't
I
they?
feel like the
I mean, yeah,
only.
but if they're doing it not for the like what they believe in. They're doing it so they don't get fined.
Yeah.
By the way, I happen to think that I agree with you. It wouldn't increase better voting, would it? It might increase more voting, but would increase the quality of voting. I think that's probably very true. All right, so in the last 25 minutes, let me ram through these notes. So the defense of a party system as part of a political system is that it adds something that it wouldn't otherwise be there if you didn't have it. Does that make sense? And so from the Wilson text, this is what are the 3 primary functions that our parties add? One thing is institutional coordination. What I mean by that is this. It increases the capacity of the government to govern. We have a system of separation of powers and checks and balances, right? I just told you that Americans vote for over 57,000 elected positions. Now, not every American votes for 57,000 positions. But what are the main positions that you vote for as a citizen, both of the government, of the country and the state, that probably do affect your life? You vote for who at the top? President. And then what?
Vice president.
Well, you vote for them together.
Yeah.
Because now it's a party phenomenon. But by the way, in many states, the governors and lieutenant governors do not run on a single ticket. So interestingly enough, you have in several states a Republican governor and a Democratic vice or lieutenant governor, or the other way around. Why does it make sense to have them vote as a ticket? If the president dies, who's going to take over? Doesn't it make sense if you want the person to take over as president, the same person as vice president, the same? Wouldn't that be more continuous?
Yeah.
But if you had a different party take over when the governor ends, then it might take you in a direction that your vote never anticipated. Does that make sense? All right. What are the positions then? All right. So you probably who's the governor of South Carolina?
Last governor I remember in South Carolina was like Nikki Haley or something.
She was.
She was.
And she's going to be on the 2020 ticket, 2024 ticket.
Oh, you think so?
Yeah, I do. As you're probably not president, but vice president.
Once I moved out of here, I didn't know.
Henry McMaster, governor. Now, here's my point. I don't want to waste too much time on it. There are some elected positions that you probably know something about. And when you come to vote, I would say there are probably 10 elected positions that most of you will know about, care about, and inform yourself on. President, vice president, senator, senators, your representative when you actually come to know what his name is, governor, and some state elections. Does that make sense? So on level, and by the way, sometimes the nation pays a lot to state and local elections. How many of you know what happened in San Francisco a month ago with the school board elections? You don't live in Southview, why do you care? Because it turns out that 3 of the 7 board members who were like really left-wing, crazy, progressive, and voted, rather than to demask and open up the schools, they voted to change all the names of the schools and spend $180 million doing it because racists like Abraham Lincoln and George Washington, they wanted to rename all the schools named after that. Now, maybe it's a good thing to to take the names away, take down Confederate statues and all that kind of stuff. But how many of you think masking and lockdowns were more important than the name of the school you go to?
Yeah.
What happened was 3 of those board members were voted out by the electorate of San Francisco, which is an overwhelmingly Democratic and progressive electorate. What does that mean? When an overwhelmingly Democratic and progressive electorate threw out 3 progressive school board, what does it mean? They were too crazy even for them. Do you see what I mean by that? So on one level, sometimes the nation pays attention to local and state elections. What state in the fall got a lot of attention for its gubernatorial election? 2 states had gubernatorial elections because they deliberately choose the governor election to be off presidential elections, so people will pay more attention to it. Virginia. Who won in Virginia? Glenn Youngkin. He was a Republican. Why is that important? Because Virginia hasn't had a Republican governor for 15 years. So why would people pay attention to that election on a national level?
Because maybe it hasn't happened, like it's different.
Well, that's one reason, but what might it be a portent of? What it might be a prediction of? The coming national elections. Do you see what I mean by that? So on one level, when you become actual voters, my guess is there will only be about 10 different offices that you'll actually ever pay attention to and vote on. Does that make sense? Now, the point I'm making about what I'm calling institutional coordination is this. We have a system of separation of powers and checks and balances. How many branches of government do we have on the national level? I'm going to come spank you if you don't answer this question.
So how many, what?
How many branches of the national government are there?
3.
Thank you. What are they?
Executive, legislative, and
Judicial.
judicial.
And what do we call the legislative branch of government?
Congress,
Yes. What do we call the executive branch of government head?
the president,
Thank you. What do we call the head of the judicial branch?
Supreme Court.
Now, one of them is not elected, it's appointed, for reasons we'll see when we turn to that institution. What party is the presidency?
What? Party?
What party is Joe Biden?
Democrat.
Thank you.
What was it?
Democrat.
Oh.
I didn't say what party did he go to last night. What party is he? Now, it's true. Both the House and the Senate are also Democrat. Now, on one level, clearly, what are a Democratic president and a Democratic Congress trying to do? We're trying to work together to get a Democratic agenda elected, right? Yet they're constitutionally separate branches of government. Now, I have to say, whatever advantages and disadvantages in a parliamentary system, the legislative and executive branch are the same branch. Therefore, it's both more dangerous and more coordinated. What's a natural problem when you start dividing up the institutions of government that have to govern together? You have to work together, right? If you're going to see, when I call institutional coordination one of the main functions of our party system is they help to link constitutionally separated branches of government. Moreover, we just don't have one central government. I hope with the old history of federalism, we have 50 state governments, right? So what prevents simple fragmentation and inability in the federal government with 3 branches at the national and 50 different state governments? The main institutional feature that actually bridges those divisions is the party system. Because it doesn't mean that a Democratic president and a Democratic Congress will always agree. And what happens if the president is of one party and the Congress is another? It turns out, on this question of gridlock and cooperation, when you read chapter 10 on the presidency, those situations where the president has been on one party and the Congress has been another actually tend to get more legislation done, interestingly enough, than when both are shared by the same party. Now, my point here is this, that's kind of counterintuitive. It makes the larger point that the political party system helps to bring together and help join and make cooperative 2 separate branches of the government on the national level and on the state level. So on one level, in a system of separation of powers and checks and balances, how many of you think that's basically a good thing, the separation of powers and checks and balances? Because what's the main thing it prevents?
Tyranny.
Tyranny. remember in Federal 51, the concentration of all powers in one set of hands. I don't care if you hate Biden or love Trump, love Biden or hate Trump. How many of you would want to live in a system with Vladimir Putin at the top?
Who's that?
What? They're not Putin's?
Vladimir Putin? Sound like a dude of Harry Potter.
Oh.
He's the head of Russia.
Oh.
He's the president of Russia. He's not the president, he's actually the premier of Russia. I mean, on one level, how many of you want to live under Xi Jinping?
That's China.
How many of you want to give an elected official that much power over your lives?
Because they basically have like what's it called again? You said it yesterday.
I think it's a totalitarian dictatorship.
Yeah, like dictators, yeah.
So why don't we have a dictator? Because we have
Free country.
separation of powers and checks and balances. Does that make sense? I mean, it has problems. One problem is coordination. What's the first thing that parties do? They help somewhat to overcome the separation. Does that make sense? And the same between the national government and the states and within the state governments. So the primaries, just one second, I want to get the point out before I distract myself again. The main thing that they contribute to our system of government is a certain amount of coordination between separated institutions. Now again, let me ask you, and I'll come back to your question. Do you think the essential separation is a good thing? But doesn't the government have to be able to act at some times? So it doesn't have to occasionally overcome that separation? Do you see my point? Political parties are the main institutional feature that enable that to happen on a regular basis. Jalen.
Oh, I was just gonna ask, I know how dictators, they just have like a more control of their lives, but like,
Because nobody can oppose them.
yeah, like what technically, like what do they have that are president? Like, what do they have?
They don't have
control over?
separation of powers and checks and balances.
Okay.
In other words, like when Hitler took over the German government in 1933, once his Nazi party got a bare plurality plus coalesced with another small party, he instantly banned all other political parties. He coordinated all political power in his hands, and he controlled all institutions of government. Did they have a judiciary? Yes, but they didn't have an independent judiciary. So no part of the political system of Germany could resist him. And the same way with Stalin. If you have a dictatorship, it means no one can oppose you. But what does the separation of powers and checks and balances do?
Limits their president's ability.
And everyone's ability. What does it do? It breaks up power and creates different centers of power. So that if one part of the government becomes tyrannical or bad, at least there are other parts of resistance to it. Does that make sense? That's how our constitutional system works. So on one level, that's good. But don't you need to overcome the separation to be able to govern and do common things at times? So on one level, the party system is the main function of our system, the main institution that helps to coordinate it, separate institutions. Does that make sense? Second, remember when we acted out the Electoral College? I know it was a month ago, it's a long time, but do you remember when we were the original Electoral College, what two functions did we perform at the same day? We nominated and elected. What has happened to the party system is, the party system grew up to essentially do the function of nominating. And if you're looking at the notes, what does that mean? It's the parties that primarily recruit candidates and try to recruit qualified candidates. They don't always succeed in doing that. They organize campaigns, they fund campaigns. So the main nominating and campaign generating structure in our system is the parties. Does that make sense? If they don't do that, and you're going to see one of the changes in our system is, since the 1970s and 80s, individual candidates are doing more of their own campaigning. And the problem with that is, individual candidate campaigns, the more they become divorced from party, the more they tend to be personal commercials. Does that make sense? And if the candidates are running their own campaigns, that means they're not connected with any other candidates. So on one level, to have the parties do the system of nominating and running campaigns means there's some first of all, somebody's got to nominate candidates, and I don't mean to sound as if the purpose of this class is to insult your intelligence and your attention to politics, but how many of you think you are informed enough to nominate good candidates to office? I actually think the American people are qualified to choose their president. But what happens when they nominate candidates? You're going to see that's a different issue. The last thing they do is, I asked you how many of you came from political families. Now, Shayla, you seem to give a different answer than you gave at first, because you said your family did have a political identity.
I mean, they're Democrats.
And you kind of grew up with that as part of your identity, right?
Yeah, they taught me to be one too, so.
Okay, and here's my point. The more likely you are to care about politics, the more likely you are to identify with a political party. Let me reverse that. The more you are pulled into the political process by identifying with a political party, the more involved in politics you are. Who tends to be the least involved segment of our population politically? Independents. Does that make sense? So, is it a good thing for the people to pay attention to politics? Do most people do that? Yet, the main institutional part of our system that encourages people to identify, pay attention in politics, it's not TikTok, and it's not Twitter, and it isn't Facebook. The political parties are the primary institutional feature that bridges the people as an organized group with governmental policy. And moreover, the critical thing that they provide is intelligent cues. Now, voting by party won't tell you exactly how everyone in that party is going to behave. How many of you are Democrats? And probably voted for Joe Biden. Has Joe Biden governed according to the way that every Democrat expected him to govern? His attempt to govern has been more shaped by the Democratic Party, to be sure. But do Democrats disagree with Biden? Did Republicans disagree with Trump? So party identification doesn't tell you everything about the way candidates will behave in office. But they do give you some sense of general direction and orientation. And as you're going to see, parties link together different issues. Now, you could say the issue of abortion, climate change, and inflation are not necessarily connected with each other. Yet, the parties do develop consistent strategies linking those issues. What if you had to have a different election for every issue that faced government?
That'd be a lot of elections.
Yeah, it'd be crazy. It would be unintelligible. So on one level, what parties do is they not only simplify choice, but in the same way that as a consumer, your choice would have been destroyed by uninformed, too much choice. Restricted, informed choice actually gives you more control over the outcome. You all understand that and agree on that? Ultimately, that's the argument for two parties. They both are moderate enough to join issues together, and so that you don't have 94 parties. But at the same time, did the American people have a choice in 2020? Now you might have said, I don't like either choice. And if you didn't like either choice, what did you probably do or not do?
You voted against one of them.
All right, well, by the way, in this case, the presidential election was so interesting because just like in 2016, probably more people voted against Hillary Clinton and voted against Donald Trump than voted for them. I know that sounds ironic, but both Trump and Hillary Clinton are two of the most polarizing figures in our political history. In other words, more people probably hated Clinton and voted against her, and more people hated Trump in 2020 and voted against him and voted for them. But, at least on one level, you all agree that it made a difference to the direction and the future of the nation depending which candidate and which party won. So, do you not see that a two-party system does limit choice, and the parties are very broad with very diverse things. But how many would want a presidential election that went from the Communist Party like to the Nazi Party? On one level, our parties do overlap and are very general. But wouldn't it be better to go from one moderate version of policy to another moderate version of policy than to lurch between completely opposite vision of the nation's choice and direction? Does that make sense? So you're going to see what the two-party system does is it does offer competition and choice. It does offer moderation because essentially the American people are not radicalized, even though we're more polarized now. Most Americans are actually pretty moderate. Most Americans are middle class. Most Americans are moderate politically. They tend to avoid the extremes. Most people in their personal lives are relatively moderate and extreme. When I first moved to Converse in Spartanburg in 1986, living under the tyranny of auto inspection, one of the news stories was this guy was crossing the nation carrying a cross that's estimated to be the size of Jesus' cross to testify the presence of Christ. Now, is that a guy pretty serious Christian? How many of you are serious Christians? But would you say that's pretty extreme Christianity? In other words, isn't it true that most of you are complex individuals that want many different things in life? And you know what that means? That means it pushes most people to the center. Because, believe it or not, most people want basically the same things in life. And that means the American electorate is basically a moderate electorate. How many of you know what a bell curve is? Okay, Lizzie, what's a bell curve?
Well, it goes like a bell, it looks like a bell on a graph, but it's used so much of like courses.
Right, how many of you had side courses or statistical courses? What does the top of the bell represent?
It's like some percentile.
Most of it, actually. And in fact, the extremes tend to be measured by what's called standard deviation. The mean or middle, most statistical phenomena tend to group around a bell curve. Which means, if you want to say politically, where are most people politically? In the middle. How many people want to tear down the system, burn it, and turn us into a totalitarian state? How many people want to destroy the government and live with no government at all? Well, the people in Portland. But you understand, those are extremes, right? Where are most Americans?
In the middle.
So what the two-party system does is tend to offer an electoral choice that looks like this. Two broad, moderate bell curves on either side of the political center. So voting for one of the two parties doesn't radically change the nature of the country, but what does it do if you vote for one of the two parties? It does move the direction of the country. Does that make sense? It's like this. If you have a small motorboat, you can turn on a dime. If you're driving an ocean cruise ship, you're not going to turn on a dime. What does directing a giant ship mean? It means nudging it in one direction. Does that make sense? We're a nation of 330 million people, 350 million people probably now. Would you want elections to overturn everything every election? But don't you want to have some choice in the direction of your life? What gives you more direction, more choice? An informed restriction between two moderate alternatives or 93 radical alternatives? Do you see the idea? And so, by the way, that's Banfield's defense. If we had a multi-party system, what would happen? We'd have many parties, right? But what would that ultimately do to information and choice? It might look like more choice, but what would actually happen to practical choice of the people?
People wouldn't know like anything.
And probably it would weaken the government because it would be harder to form governing coalitions. So on one level, it's not just one, two, multi-parties and issues and candidates. Each one of those alternatives means a profoundly different political and an electoral environment. Does that make sense? Now, I didn't finish the things I wanted to finish today. But I hope I made you think about some things and made you think about the party system. By the way, here's what Banfield does. What I'll do on Monday, by the way, is finish with the thrust of the article. Some of the other things will still start the presidency. But let me walk you through Banfield's article. Banfield is responding to critics of the two-party system because he says, people think our parties are Tweedledum and Tweedledee. Where does that come from, the reference Tweedledum and Tweedledee?
Alice.
Yeah, what does it mean?
They're dumb and dumber.
No,
No, it's
They're
not.
not fighting each other.
they were twins, right?
Yeah.
Yeah, I mean, there were no difference between them.
Oh.
Have you ever heard people say it doesn't matter whether you vote Democrat or they're the same thing? Well, they aren't the same thing, but they're profoundly moderate and overlapping, right? Some people argue that our parties are just collections of interest and don't really stand for anything, but that's not quite true. There are actually real choices involved. Wouldn't the country be different with Build Back Better than without it? Regardless if you support it or oppose it. How many of you know what Build Back Better is? That was President Biden's primary governing program. Now, here's Biden's point, or Banfield's point. If we went to a multi-party system, there'd be lots of little parties, right? And that means that the electorate would be more fractionalized. Would it be easier to govern with 90 parties or 2 parties?
Two.
Would people be more unified under 2 parties or 90 parties?
2.
30 parties, let's use a regular.
Two.
So on one level, his point is this. if you take all of the defects of what people see in the American party system, and then take an ideal party system where people only vote for one principled issue at a time, which starts to look like single issue voting, and then add one of the defects, like flexibility and moderateness. His point is, it turns out you actually get a better political system, in which you can govern better, in which people are more connected. Does that make sense? So if you read Banfield's article, the main defense of the two-party system is you take all the criticisms of the party system, build an alternative model based on it, and it turns out that's pretty shitty. It can't govern, it doesn't unite, it doesn't inform, it doesn't engage, and if you add one of the defects, a certain amount of interest to the parties, all of a sudden you move back to the American party system. So his main defense is, it's more intelligent, structured, limited, but intelligent choice that actually moderates and engages at the same time. Now you may go. Don't take the matzah. It's actually your box of matzah.
Yeah, no, this
Take it back to the dorm. Those people are starving there.
No, we're not starving.
Jalen? Wave high. You are waving high.